The scorching Arizona desert sun punished the small Miller farm. Sarah Miller, a woman in her early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much, gazed at the dusty horizon. The sturdy figure of her husband, John, was no longer by her side. Only the deafening silence of the empty house and the echo of the recent tragedy remained. John had been brutally murdered by a gang of 7 men known as the Desert Dogs, who terrorized the region, robbing and killing. Without mercy, the pain of loss was a heavy burden, but instead of crushing her, it ignited a cold, relentless flame in Sarah's heart. She was no longer the young wife who hid behind her husband. Widowhood had transformed her into something tougher, more resilient. The farm, once a haven of love and labor, was now the stage for her solitude and her growing desire for justice. The few savings John had left would be her only resource, and with each sunset, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility and the urgency to act. The main conflict was clear: 7 men. 7 lives that would pay for John's. Sarah knew she couldn't face them head-on. She had no weapons, no combat training. But she possessed something they underestimated: a sharp mind, unwavering patience, and an intimate knowledge of those arid lands. Vengeance would not be an impetuous act, but a meticulous strategy, built with the intelligence and cunning of someone who had nothing left to lose. Sarah's survival was now intrinsically linked to the downfall of her enemies. Sarah began her preparation with an almost military rigor. She scoured the farm for anything that could be useful. Old hunting traps, worn ropes, rusty tools, everything was cataloged in her mind. The barn, once a storage for hay and grains, became her headquarters. There, by the flickering light of a lantern, she drew plans, sketched diagrams, and tested rudimentary contraptions. With each knot she tied, each piece she fitted, John's image emerged in her mind, fueling her determination. The Desert Dogs were led by a cruel and cunning man named Silas the Butcher Blackwood. He and his 6 men brutes like Bear O'Malley, the cold marksman Eagle-Eye Jenkins, the silent Shadow Ramirez, the twin brothers Sabertooth and Fang Peterson, and the young and impulsive Billy the Hothead Carson, were feared throughout the region. Sarah knew she needed to understand their routines, their weaknesses, and their arrogance. She spent days observing from a distance, hidden among the rocks and cacti, mapping their movements, listening to their crude conversations and their looting plans. One day, while observing the gang at a makeshift camp, Sarah noticed the latent rivalry between Silas and Bear. Bear, the physically stronger one, seemed to resent Silas's authority, and their arguments were frequent. Sarah saw a crack there, an opportunity to sow discord. She also noticed Billy Carson's dependence on the others, a young man who seemed to be there more out of fear than conviction. These observations became crucial pieces in her puzzle of revenge. The first real obstacle arose when a gang scout, a man named Lightfoot Johnson, got too close to the farm. Sarah, heart-pounding but mind-cold, used a simple but effective trap, a rope stretched between 2 trees, camouflaged by vegetation. Johnson fell, disoriented, and Sarah quickly immobilized him. Instead of killing him, she interrogated him, extracting valuable information about the gang's plans and, more importantly, about the route they would use to transport their next loot. Johnson, terrified and humiliated, was left tied and gagged. With a subtle message for Silas, the spider weaves its web. The message left for Lightfoot Johnson resonated among the Desert Dogs more than Silas would admit. A lone woman daring to challenge them? Sarah's audacity, instead of intimidating them, ignited the gang's fury. Silas, with his ego wounded, decided it was time to put an end to that annoying fly. He planned a massive assault on the Miller farm, intending to leave no stone unturned. The news reached Sarah through a terrified neighboring rancher who had overheard the bandits' plans in town. Time was running out. Sarah knew this would be her only chance. On a moonless night, she acted with feverish speed, but with a surgeon's precision. She transformed the farm, which was once her home, into a minefield of ingenuity. She dug shallow trenches camouflaged with dry foliage on the main trail leading to the house, placing sharp stakes at the bottom. In the blind spots, where the vegetation was denser, she hung improvised bells made of cans and metal scraps, tied to nearly invisible fishing lines. In the barn, her headquarters, she set a trap with a heavy beam suspended by a rope. The house, once full of memories, was now a fortress of silent traps. The emotional weight of using her own home for such a purpose was overwhelming, but the image of John Bloody was a stronger motivator than any pain. When the 7 desert dogs emerged on the horizon, mounted on their horses with torches lit, Sarah's heart pounded erratically. The sound of their horses and Silas's shouts, inciting his men, were like an infernal symphony. However, instead of panic, a cold calm settled within her. There was no more room for fear, only for strategy and execution. She watched from the dusty kitchen window, her eyes fixed on the main trail. The turning point came with the first scream. Billy Carson, the youngest and most impetuous, who led the charge at Silas's insistence, was the first to fall, his horse rearing and throwing him into one of the camouflaged trenches. His cries of pain and confusion echoed through the air. Sarah's trap worked perfectly. The other bandits hesitated, their disordered advance turning into chaos. Sabretooth and Fang Peterson tried to flank, but were caught off guard by the bells, which jingled in the night silence, revealing their position and forcing them to retreat. The confidence and arrogance of the desert dogs were shattered in a matter of seconds. They expected an easy victim. They found a silent predator. The night turned into a nightmare for the desert dogs. Sarah, invisible in the shadows of her own farm, used the terrain she knew like the back of her hand. She wasn't just reacting. She was leading them where she wanted them. Eagle Eye Jenkins, the gang's sharpshooter, tried to position himself for a clean shot, but Sarah had planted sound traps at various points. At the slightest movement in the vegetation, cans rattled, distracting him and causing him to miss his shots, which ricocheted dangerously close to his own companions. Frustration grew among the bandits. Most impactful was the fight that erupted between Silas and Bear. Bear, wounded in the arm by a stake Sarah had disguised near the pasture fence, blamed Silas for underestimating the woman. "Your ego brought us here, Blackwood. We're trapped like rats," he roared. Silas, furious at the insubordination, drew his weapon, but Shadow Ramirez intervened, reminding them of the urgency of the situation. The disunity was palpable, exactly as Sarah had predicted. As the gang disintegrated into distrust and rage, Sarah underwent her own transformation. Every movement, every successful trap, reinforced her belief in herself. The initial fear had been replaced by a calculating coldness. She moved like a shadow, her dark widow's dress blending with the darkness of the night. There were moments of reflection, yes. John's face appeared in her mind, but no longer with overwhelming pain, but with a kind of strength. He would be proud, she thought, as she prepared the next stage of her plan. The decision not to surrender, to fight with her intelligence, was the most difficult and most liberating she had ever made. She knew the night was her ally. As the men grew tired and more reckless, Sarah remained alert, fueled by adrenaline and the desire for revenge. She saw Fang Peterson fall into a noose trap, hanging by his feet, and heard him scream to exhaustion, while his companions ignored him, too concerned with their own lives. The pain of her enemies didn't bring her joy, but a confirmation that she was on the right path. She was surviving, not just physically, but also in spirit, transcending the pain of loss to become something stronger, more relentless. The sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky with orange hues and revealing the silent carnage of the night. Of the 7 desert dogs, only 3 remained: Silas the Butcher Blackwood, Bear O'Malley, and Shadow Ramirez. The bodies of their companions lay scattered across the farm, some caught in traps, others wounded, abandoned by their own. Fear, exhaustion, and distrust had turned into a potent poison within what remained of the gang. Silas, his face contorted with hatred and humiliation, bellowed, "Miller, come out, you witch! Show your rat face!" He fired random shots towards the house, his fury eclipsing any strategy. Bear, limping and exhausted, realized the situation was unsustainable. "Silas, there's nothing here. She broke us. We have to leave," he pleaded, but the words were in vain. Silas's mind was fixed on revenge for his own humiliation. Sarah, watching from her strategic position in the barn, waited for the right moment. She knew Silas would come to the house. His arrogance wouldn't allow otherwise. Bear tried to drag Silas away, but the butcher violently pushed him. "You're a coward, Bear. I'm going to finish this." The culminating moment occurred when Silas, consumed by blind rage, burst through the front door of the house. The floorboards creaked under his heavy feet. Shadow Ramirez, more cautious, remained at the entrance, his weapon pointed. Bear, defeated, watched from a distance, knowing this would be the end. Sarah, unseen, pulled the master rope. With a sinister creak, the heavy beam she had prepared in the barn ceiling above their camping spot crashed down. It wasn't meant to hit Silas, but to create a distraction. The deafening crash of the falling wood, the dust that rose, and Bear's desperate cry, who was closer and grazed, drew the attention of Silas and Ramirez. In that instant of confusion, Sarah acted. She had sneaked to the back of the house. As Silas turned to see what was happening in the barn, and Ramirez looked at his injured colleague, Sarah emerged from the kitchen's back door, not with a gun, but with John's old butcher knife. Her attack was quick and silent. Shadow Ramirez, the most agile, sensed the danger and tried to react, but Sarah was faster. In a fluid, desperate move, she disarmed him and used his own inertia against him, pushing him towards the old water pump in the yard. The rusty pipe, which she had previously loosened, gave way under Ramirez's weight, trapping him. His screams were muffled. Silas, seeing what was happening, finally realized the extent of the trap he had fallen into. Sarah, eyes fixed and burning with the flame of revenge, advanced on him. He fired, but the shot grazed her shoulder. Silas, now alone and surrounded by Sarah's psychological and physical traps, tried to escape to his horse. But Sarah had already sabotaged the saddle. When he mounted, the saddle flipped, throwing him onto the dusty ground. She approached, John's knife in her hands. The final confrontation was not a struggle of strength, but a battle of wills. Morning after the night's nightmare found Sarah Miller exhausted, but with a quietness in her heart she hadn't felt since John's death. Silas the Butcher Blackwood lay on the farm ground, a fitting end to his tyranny. Sarah had kept her promise. Revenge was a dish served cold, and she was the chef. The other gang members were incapacitated or dead, terrified and defeated by a woman they cruelly underestimated. The farm scene was a silent testament to Sarah's cunning and determination. Trenches, improvised traps, and the trail of despair the gang left behind. Sarah didn't feel the euphoria she might have expected. Instead, there was a sense of emptiness, a heavy burden that had finally been lifted. She looked at the sky, at the sun that now shone relentlessly over the arid land, and felt warm tears stream down her face. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of relief and a kind of deep soul exhaustion. She knelt beside a solitary cactus, John's knife still in her hand, and buried it in the dry earth, symbolizing the end of that chapter. News of the desert dog's downfall at the hands of a single woman spread like wildfire. Neighboring ranchers, once terrified, came to the Miller farm, not to mourn, but to witness and express their admiration. Sarah, once just John's widow, was now a living legend, the woman who tamed 7 bandits. The community rallied to help rebuild the farm and clear the traces of the battle. It was a rebirth, not just for Sarah, but for the entire region that had lived under the gang's yoke. She tied up the loose ends of the plot by ensuring the few surviving gang members were handed over to the authorities, carrying with them the story of the terror they experienced at the hands of a seemingly defenseless woman. Sarah sought no glory or reward. She sought peace. The farm, with every trap dismantled and every hole filled, slowly returned to being a home. The seeds John had planted and that she had cared for began to sprout, symbolizing a new beginning. 2 years passed since the night Sarah Miller became an Arizona legend. The Miller farm prospered again under her care. She cultivated the land with the same determination she used to hunt the bandits, and the apple orchard, planted by John years earlier, finally began to bear abundant fruit. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the singing of birds and the soft murmur of the wind, a sound of peace that Sarah had earned at such a cost. The story of the woman who tamed 7 bandits echoed through the saloons and campfires of the frontier, told and retold, gaining new details each time. Children listened with wide eyes, and rough men shook their heads in respect. Sarah never sought fame, but notoriety found her. Occasionally, a curious traveler would stop at the farm, hoping for a glimpse of the legendary widow. Sarah received them with reserved hospitality, offering a glass of fresh water and a few kind words, but never boasted of her deeds. She learned that revenge, while satisfying in its conclusion, does not fill the void left by loss. True growth came from overcoming, from the ability to transform pain into strength, and from the choice to rebuild, not just the farm, but her own life. The central lesson of her journey was not about violence, but about the resilience of the human spirit and the unwavering will to survive in the face of the cruelest adversity. Sarah Miller remained on the farm, a solitary figure, but not alone. The community respected and protected her. She found a new routine, a hard-won peace. At dusk, she would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert with vibrant hues, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, the sun always shines again. And as she did, a gentle smile blossomed on her lips, a silent tribute to John's memory and the strong woman she had become.